Everything I've given you looks at humanity in general, generic humanity. At best, it looks at Israel in general. However, this Imago Dei language, this becomes especially prominent in Christianity, where I'd like you to go in answering this question is, what does it mean to image God? Look to the one who is described in Colossians 1 as the image of the invisible God. It is in Jesus that his Jewish followers, Israelites, who knew the stuff that I've already mentioned, well, they didn't know about non-reductive physicalism, but they knew about covenant, and they knew about language, and they knew about most of it. Having grown up with that framework, when they see him, they go, that's how God is imaged. John 1:18, no one has ever seen God. All right? Right? No one has ever seen God. But the only begotten God, or the only begotten Son in the bosom of the Father, has made him known. We've seen him. So I gave you two images. Let me give you two more images. Here is Imago Dei. That's an image of Christ reigning. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. This guy is seated in heaven at the right hand of the Father. You want to know who God is? Look at Jesus, and you'll see who God is. That's a bedrock Christian claim, right? Or another Pantocrator. By the way, Pantocrator is a great word. It means ruler of everything. There's a modern one. Again, the Alpha and the Omega. And look at the little ball under his feet. That's the world at his feet. He's lifted up by four creatures. Down on the bottom, a lion and a bull. Up at the top, a human being and an eagle. Those are the four beasts of Revelation, riffing on Ezekiel. But the church uses them to personify Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He's known through the gospel to be this Lord of all creation. This first century Nazarene, Galilean. Our intuitions don't go here. We start going empirically, like, okay, what about humanity? What about us in general? What about my own constitution? That's where I'm going to find out what image is God. Actually, no. The definitive, the determinative understanding of what it means to image God is going to be from the image himself, the Son of the Father, the Word incarnate. All right? Our habits tempt us to look somewhere else than Jesus to answer these questions. But the answer, according to his followers, according to the New Testament church, the answer is here. Jesus is the one who crossed that gulf, separating God and creation. Jesus isn't, Michelangelo gives us a little tiny gap between God's finger and Adam's finger. There's no gap anymore. In fact, there aren't even two hands, there's one. All right? I'll preach more on this as the semester goes on, but trying to get in the habit of looking to Jesus for answers to these questions. Jesus has official faculties. He has a threefold office. He has functions. His functions are summed up in the title Messiah, anointed one, anointed for specific functions. And Jesus' function is displayed as royal authority. Okay? Jesus is human power, but his human power manifests itself as authority over creation, of a king. But an interesting kind of king, not the usual oppressor, tyrant type, but a servant king. A redeeming king, a king who rescues his domain. So that Jesus' lordship it yields hope. When we see Jesus reign, we think creation has a good future. This is a representative who represents a good God. You could even put it this way in terms of another charge that human beings are given. We're given the charge to love God with all our strength. And Jesus loves the one who sent him and loves his neighbor with all strength. He is the Pantocrator, the ruler of all. All right? So Jesus' official faculties, Jesus' function shows you what it means to be human, the way humans ought to be human. It shows us how God ought to be represented through us and among us. Jesus has relationships, right? In Jesus' social faculties, in his relationships, he embodies justice. You hear a lot about the word justice in the 21st century, back in the 20th. Well, Jesus displays justice, but the justice, well, the word justice is actually a relational word. Justice describes right relationships, right? For me to oppress you is unjust. Well, Jesus doesn't oppress. He acts towards others with the righteousness of the covenant, with the righteousness of God, with grace, with love, with regard for others, humility. All right? Jesus' justice doesn't destroy others, it cultivates others. It raises and heals them. All right? You could say that Jesus fulfills the commandment to love God with all his heart. He loves God with all his heart through his relational justice and righteousness and mercy. He displays how we ought to image God in our relationships with one another. Right? Let them be one as we are one. Let them love one another as we love one another. Jesus has personal faculties, right? He's a human being. He's one human person. He's divine and human. We'll get there. But Jesus' personal qualities, his character, his own, if you want to use the word individual character, manifests the holiness of God, right? It manifests the difference and the goodness of God in particular ways. Character is like human substance, you know? That's an off the top of my head definition, but character is the substance of a human life. And Jesus' sheer human substance demonstrates how we ought to represent God as ourselves. All right? You might also say that he embodies the love of God with all his mind, with all his qualities. And what about relationship with oneself? Well, Jesus is entirely true and transparent to himself. He shows no sign of self-deceit, no sign of self-misrepresentation or unawareness. He lives a life of full integrity, right? Integrity is like a personal coherence. It's when all of your qualities are at peace with one another, and there's no internal battle. Robert Barron's book is going to talk about the riven self, the broken self, by which sin wrecks our image of God. Jesus has personal peace and full insight into himself. And when you're at peace with yourself and you have insight into yourself, you can speak and act in honesty, right? And transparency, which demonstrates how we ought to represent God in our own self-integrity. Loving God with all of our soul, or all of our self. To maintain all the claims that I've made up until this point, some Christians claim that I can only say what I've said if the biblical material on Adam and Eve refers to a literal historical human being who you could have got on tape or through a DNA test. Is that the case? Some Christians will insist, yes, it is. Genesis 2 suggests it by giving us a literal ancestor from whom we're all descended. And even argue that Paul implies the same thing in making Jesus a new Adam that brings a trajectory of righteousness into the world the way the original Adam brought a trajectory of death and sin to the world. But there are others who say you don't need a literal human being, Adam, in order to make all the claims I've just made. The literary figure of Adam can represent whatever beginning humanity had that received this vocation, received this office, received these faculties, and blew it. And instead of following, refused. For the purposes of this class and at 1021, I'm going to say either of those positions is defensible and orthodox, at least at the moment. All right? They can't both be right, but neither one seems to compromise the gospel itself.